Welcome to MSD at Home as part of the Melbourne Design Week 2021. Tonight we present our third panel discussion in our series on politics and utopia in architecture. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the ancient lands on which we all virtually gather for this panel, the Wurundjeri, the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this webinar. We acknowledge that the land, sea and sky were never ceded and pay our deepest respect to their elders, past, present and future. With our series, Politics and Utopia, we argue that architectural practice and thinking is and always has been fundamentally political. We suggest that architects, while dealing with the many contemporary crises, hold the chance and responsibility or opportunities to propose and work on a better future for all, hence the utopia in the title. As part of our series of panels, we are hosting tonight the presentations and discussions around the topic of shaping future societies. Can we, as architects or architecture, shape future societies? Do we have the capacity or opportunities to influence how we think about our future as a human race? My name is Associate Professor Rochus Hinkel, and I'm co-convening tonight's panel together with my colleague, Dr. Peter Raisbeck.
Yes, thank you, Rochus. My name is Dr. Peter Raisbeck, and I'd also like to welcome you to tonight's panel, where we'll discuss, does architecture and architects have the potential to enhance necessary future societal changes that address our current crises, from climate collapse to the loss of biodiversity to social injustice. Now, I'm quite interested in wanting to discuss with our eminent guest, does architecture have utopian agency? And I think I'd like to start with a kind of epigraph from Colin Rowe's Collage City. Rowe wrote, "Modern architecture is surely most cogently to be interpreted as a gospel, as quite literally a message of good news, and hence its impact. For when all the smoke clears away, its impact may be seen as having very little to do with either its technological innovations or its formal vocabulary. Indeed, the value of these could never have been so much what they seem to be as what they signified." So the question for me, I think, is, are architects enamoured with utopia as a signified rather than its reality?
Politics and utopia in architecture derives from exploration we've been undertaking in the pedagogical context of the Melbourne School of Design in a Master of Architecture Design Studio, Studio 40. We find it important and necessary that we raise these complex questions and challenging and contemporary questions in our architecture schools across the country and potentially internationally. In Studio 40, we want to acknowledge the numerous challenges we face and develop creative and utopian proposals as a response. Tonight, we are yet sitting in another virtual space in front of a simple shed for volunteers who gather on country for indigenous food production. The building is constructed from recycled timber and is built slowly over time. It's a design proposal by Dylan Newell, a master student currently finishing his master thesis.
All right, before we start the panel, a few comments for those who haven't watched these and for those who haven't been here before. We see these panel discussions as an opportunity to bring difficult topics into discourse, raise awareness and build an ongoing engagement and discussion within our school, within the broader architectural profession, and even in broader society. Rochus and I, as facilitators, are certainly here to learn from our eminent guests and to learn from each other. We'll be excited to share with you our own struggles as we discuss some of these wicked and environmental, sociological and political topics. We don't claim to be experts, certainly not in such a eminent field and panel that we have tonight. And we see these discussions as a platform for exchange, activism, and indeed learning.
So welcome again to our three guests, and I start to introduce from New York, Professor Felicity Scott. Welcome. Felicity is Professor of Architecture, Director of the PhD program in Architecture, History and Theory, and co-director of the program in Critical, Curatorial and Conceptual Practices in Architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. Her books include Architecture or Techno-Utopia, Politics After Modernism, from MIT Press, 2007, and Farm, from ACTAR, 2008, Outlaw Territories, Environments of Insecurity, Architectures of Counter-Insurgency, Sternberg, 2016, and Disorientations, Bernard Rudofsky in the Empire of Science from Sternberg Press in 2016. Welcome, Felicity. Thank you for joining us from New York.
Thank you.
Great pleasure to introduce Jonathan. Jonathan Lovell is an architectural historian whose research explores architecture's potential as a medium of communication. He has recently completed a PhD at the University of Melbourne, which investigated how the artists involved with the expanded cinema movement of the 60s and 70s used the combined force of media, performance and architecture to evoke the phenomenological conditions associated with transcendental experiences. And I'm told that Jonathan did not take acid as he was doing his thesis. That's certainly a great thesis, so I'll be very keen to hear what he has to say. So welcome, Jonathan, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here.
And last but not least, I have the pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Lee Stickels from the Architecture faculty at the University of Sydney. His historical research on international countercultural and ecological design experimentation has been published widely across scholarly, professional, and popular media. He contributes to the Architectural Theory Review Editorial Committee and the International Advisory Board for Counterculture Studies. Most often, though, he can be found riding bikes.
Now, thank you, Rochus. Tonight, each panelist will give a short presentation about their experience, practices, thoughts, and writings on our general topic area, and we're eager to hear a discussion following that. So, Felicity, thank you so much again for coming along, and I'd like to hand it over to you.
First, a hearty thank you to Peter Raisbeck and Rochus Hinkel for inviting me to speak at this roundtable on shaping future societies, and to be part of a conversation about how to think architecture in relation to politics and utopia today, how to interpret the discipline's claim on utopian agency, even its capacity for world-making. So these are all serious, if difficult, questions for architecture to navigate. And as the agenda of this year's Melbourne Design Week suggests, seemingly more urgent in the wake of the events of 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, which so brutally reminded us all of the porosity and global interdependence of biological, technical, social, and economic systems, and of the violent forms of differentiation through which global capital operates. We've all witnessed the role of environmental destruction, viral mutations that cross species barriers and circulate so effectively within human infrastructures. And we've encountered in vastly uneven ways the differentiated forms of racial, economic, and gender precarity scripted by this global apparatus, inequities designed through economic and political strategy and by architecture. If this all seems obvious now and impossible to ignore, the question of how architecture is entangled in this violence, and in turn how or if it might participate in making a better world together, is far less self-evident and warrants disciplinary self-reflection and reckoning. For these issues get at the very heart of what architects do, the roles they play or might play in imagining and scripting futures, typically thought to be better or more just futures. But as we are painfully aware, betterment does not always come to pass. Idealism can be dangerous, raising the specter of responsibility. The more I ponder these terms together, architecture, politics, shaping, future, societies, change, and wondered how to respond to your invitation, the more irreconcilable and shifting in valence each term became, as contradictions and tensions proliferated in multiple directions. So in particular, the term utopia became ruthlessly ambivalent, even something like malicious. Not that this is all that new to my work. So when you invoke utopia in a series also addressing indigenous knowledge systems and the so-called Anthropocene, one needs to attend to the slippage between sort of signaling in the language of the good and pointing to that which is impossibly ideal, particularly with respect to social conditions or systems of governing people and environments. So, as already evident, you've provoked me to respond polemically or in a less sublimated manner than I typically choose to speak as a historian. And what I want to offer in my 20 minutes here are thoughts on shaping future societies that try to get to the question of whose politics and whose utopia. To do so, I want to schematically recall aspects of my historical research before asking where, in what registers, by whom, and whose interest does that shaping take place, and how its conception might be subject to a constant process of unsettling, deinstitutionalization, and contestation. And I realize that such conversations can quickly devolve into platitudes or directives, some of which I've already performed, but will try to avoid proliferating too many more in favor of something like tactical points for epistemic disobedience and intervention. So first, to recall vignettes from 1960s and 70s, which speak in different ways to scripting futures, and will set up my argument that follows. In the late 1990s, I started to work on so-called alternative and countercultural architectures in the American context. This research focused initially on dome-building communes such as Drop City in Colorado, founded in 1967, and on related do-it-yourself print media platforms such as Dome Cookbook and Dome Book series, which followed from the example of Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, which is on the right. And in turn, I started to write on the work of the Ant Farm Collective, founded in 1968 and famously turning to video in the early 1970s. So this research was initially responded to or was provoked by the dominance of European examples in then contemporary scholarship on experimental architecture, which was largely focused on Italy and Austria and Japan and France, and to the patently absurd echo chamber of the so-called grays versus whites debate, in which architecture students were often given the choice of learning from Las Vegas or the New York Five as ways to be radical or avant-garde. Effectively a choice between celebrating architecture's integration into capital and therefore its alignment with Nixon's silent white majority, or an architectural autonomy that pretended to bracket out the discipline's entanglements with capitalist forces, ignoring social and technological concerns. My research on utopian refusals of or withdrawals from capital and the forms of life it fostered continued with a study of open land communes in Northern California, the two images on the left here, in my Outlaw Territories book, and in turn, in a critique of Brand's, Stuart Brand's, cynical mobilization of American whole earth and hippie culture at the 1972 Stockholm Conference, the first so-called World Conference on the Environment, which is the image on the right. So these examples serve to demonstrate how seemingly utopian visions of alternative social and environmental realities in the US trafficked in problematic forms of cultural appropriation of Native American culture and pioneer mentalities, and in paradigms of environmental thinking ranging from the dangerously naive to Brand's neoliberal libertarianism and his use of seemingly political actors to in fact diffuse oppositional politics. So this trajectory continues in some sense with my work on habitat, the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, which took place in Vancouver in June 1976. Emerging out of the Stockholm Conference and in association with World Bank and other economic development agencies, Habitat II sought, under the language of the good, in this case modernization achieved through aid and technical assistance to so-called poor countries, to institute global norms and policies for governing the built environment and populations within it. So here we find the global South integrated into the capitalist machinery in a stratified, hierarchical way, one retooling the violent legacies of colonial rule and gender inequality under the name of development. Once again, we find an array of architectural figures trafficking in notions of progressive or utopian futures, one advancing along of telos and appealing to environmental and experimental agendas, from our Buckminster Fuller's Now House, which is actually on the right, and the countercultural aesthetic of Habitat Forum, which was set up for non-governmental groups like self-help platforms on the left here, and even to an architectural competition targeting the Tondo squatter settlement in Manila. And so I read the latter as a call for architects to participate in the forced dispossession of a precarious community under the rhetoric of humanitarian aid. And this involved any number of so-called utopian architects like Yona Friedman, whose project here is on the right. So this interest in alternative architectures ends with Project One, or research on Project One, an urban commune in San Francisco's South of Market District, a story of idealism in deploying obsolescent industrial environments as tools to script new selves and new subjectivity and new communities, one that I critically resituate as also harboring a complex entanglement with the computer technologies and engineers then scripting the online worlds we inhabit today. We actually see Stuart Brand appearing again there on the right. So in this sense, that research connects back to my earlier work on the architecture machine group at MIT, once celebrated for its vanguard role in introducing computers into architecture, but that in fact emerged as one among many counterinsurgency think tanks, the legacies of which refracted back from the violence of the Vietnam War and other US-led counterinsurgency operations, overt or covert, onto minority populations in the US, eventually to rescript so many aspects of our lives, again, our lives that are now so largely online. So these are the real actors scripting the rules of the game, shaping future societies and increasingly planetary scales. And there's a multitude of ways in which architecture participated in this machinery, wittingly or unwittingly. So finally, I'm now working on 1970s space colonization, a story that takes the techno-scientific dimensions and expansionist imaginaries of certain utopias and their shared telos of progress to a post-planetary extreme, amplifying their racializing logics and claims to benefiting mankind, this time as a species. So architecture and engineering provide utopian images of the means to shape future societies, but in so doing become entangled in a dystopian imaginary marking out capitalism's extreme forms of violence and segregation. So at stake in much of this work was, or is, in the first instance, acknowledging how such practices sought to script alternative futures, working to interrupt or unsettle the normative or traditional role of architecture as a political technology, while often consolidating it in new forms. In the second instance, it draws out how such utopian alternatives at times perpetuated dominant narratives and the racializing imaginaries like Manifest Destiny, their political valence also shifting dramatically when put into a dialogue with the so-called Global South, connections mediated through the transforming geopolitical landscape then being forged by institutions like the United Nations, as well as the US-led military-industrial academic complex and other arms of neoliberal capital. So the coupling of the pandemic and social struggles over the last year seems relevant to understand this type of ambivalence. The impact of COVID-19 remains at the center of a paradoxical political battle in the US, with government agents torn between responsibility to protect citizens' lives and to ensure the security of a market-driven capitalism, a system nevertheless reliant on government intervention, policies, subsidies, and more, despite repeated claims to the contrary. Architecture navigates a similar political ambivalence, switching between caring for bodies and subjectivities and serving an economy that often seeks to exploit them. It gives shapes to techniques of governance and forms of regulation of the milieu, tying the productivity of the population and the environment intimately to economies. This raises the question of how to attend not only to tropes affiliated with the good, like care, assistance, progress, technical efficiency, utopia, of course, and all the things that make those involved with architecture feel good, but to more complicated engagements and entanglements with capital. Just a bit of final images with some space colonization. So last April, in trying to grapple with COVID-19, I fell back on Foucault's security, territory, population, imagining that his analysis of contagious diseases, contagious agents, and food scarcity, with their transformative impact on planning urban space, economic liberalism, and the emergence of an apparatus of security might offer some footholds to understanding this situation. Had coronavirus done for the globalized world what plague did for the town? But what caught my attention, however, were Foucault's prefatory remarks, wherein he acknowledged that, whether intended or not, theoretical or analytical discourses remain, as he put it, permeated or underpinned by something like an imperative discourse, distancing his position as a speaking subject from either the aesthetic mode, what he called love this, hate this is good, this is bad, be for this, beware of that, or from imperatives like strike against this and do so in this way. He underscored the role played in his practice as a writer of, and I quote, a field of forces that cannot be created by a speaking subject alone, pointing to knowledge effects produced by the struggles, confrontations, and battles that take place within our society, and by tactics of power that are the elements of this struggle, end of quote. So within such a practice theory relay, he identified the possibility of a philosophy attending to a politics of truth beyond its own, when offering what he called tactical pointers, a conditional imperative of the kind: if you want to struggle, here are some key points, here are some lines of force, here are some constrictions and blockages. Whether intended or not, architectural history, criticism, and pedagogy produce something like an imperative discourse too, not always taking the form of love this, hate this, but often not unlike it either. They tend to say, go forth and multiply in my image, speak my discourse, deploy my program, be useful. Utopia has been a powerful weapon in this arsenal, serving to offer seductive and motivating images of a better world and suggesting a role for architecture in its production. But we might ask whether, in so doing, utopia captures imaginations too quickly, bracketing out more complicated forms of entanglement, potentially blinding us to architecture's proximity to violent modes of operation upon the environment and living beings. Indeed, in retrospect, we might question architecture's tendency to propose or advocate impractically ideal social and political schemes, to cite the dictionary definition of utopia, and ask what happens when it focuses on its involvement with capitalist expansion. Can we find it seeking a similar circle of struggle and truth, to cite Foucault, or evidence of solidarities or counter practices that don't realign with Western idealism, Enlightenment notions of progress, and their long-standing relation to capital? It's easier to find evidence of architects and historians retreating to architecture with a capital A, wherein they find a wealth of utopian ideals and progressive narratives of the future seemingly proper to disciplinary and discursive norms, those demarcating a safer inside and perpetuated in media and pedagogy. I was struck recently by an example of how architecture perpetuates such norms and boundaries. Prompted by an invitation to moderate a panel for a series called Black Boxing Banner, I returned to Rainer Banham, the British critic's posthumously published text, A Black Box, The Secret Profession of Architecture, and was surprised by what I found. Banham's long-standing appeal to open the field up to that which it excluded, whether protagonists, the notion of environment, or cultural practices deemed not quite architecture, was in many senses reversed, in favor of a call to order, a retreat to architecture, offering a forceful reminder of how institutions work. Within this series, Kyle Moe beautifully dissected Benham's limited conception of environment in the well-tempered environment, detailing how his preoccupation with mechanical equipment and closed systems environments sponsored an architecture of environmentally sealed boxes and formal expression of mechanical equipment. However, I was struck instead by Benham's refusal to challenge the discipline's Eurocentrism. At one point, he defined architecture as, and I quote, the progression of those styles and monuments of the European mainstream, from Stonehenge to Staatsgaleria, a reference to James Sterling, even suggesting that, and I quote, recognizing the very straitened boundaries of architecture as an academically teachable subject, we might deceive and confuse ourselves less if we stopped trying to cram the whole globe into its intellectual portfolio. He also points, and I quote, to the vulgar cultural imperialism that leads writers of general histories of architecture to co-opt absolutely everything built upon the Earth's crust into their subject matter, concluding with the dialectic of architecture opening up to the profane and vulgar at risk of destroying itself or closing ranks to continue as a conspiracy of secrecy as an internal discipline. If on the one hand, we might chuckle at his reading of architecture as a secret culture, as an arcane and privileged aesthetic code, accountable only to itself, when bounded by Western culture, the Latin language, and its own myths, today we find his reference to the protected area of Western civilization to be no laughing matter. Indeed, it appears key to structural forms of whiteness as a mark of its epistemological violence that warrant dismantling. So historians and design pedagogy remain key to scripting disciplinary myths, utopian ideals, and narratives of the future. Beyond serving as gatekeepers for canons of actors and works, or fostering notions like structural efficiency and truth to materials, or their polemical inversions, they contribute to the socialization of architects and hence to the shaping of future societies. I'm well aware that opening architecture up to something like an outside, whether Indigenous knowledge systems, challenges to unchecked anthropocentrism and industrialization, or its threateningly complex entanglements with a wider biopolitical apparatus, is likely to provoke both new forms of capture and re-territorialization and new forms of foreclosure. Yet it remains important work, keeping the discipline open to contestation and constant renegotiation. I do think things can change for the better, and that architects have a role in addressing issues of climate, public health, and social justice, and of inflecting global machineries in ways that shift their political disposition. A backlash might or probably will follow, but the struggle begins again. So architects, as we know, make projects in the sense of a projection or throwing forward, a practice involving creative acts and political strategy, and implying a necessary futurity. Futures remain, of course, structurally uncertain, unknowable, and difficult to plan, regulate, and manage. They're subject to risk, insecurity, and speculation. Faced with the paradox of the impossibility of planning today, but also its psychological necessity, and with a disciplinary expectation to plan, architects tend to make claims in the form of ought to. Moreover, the discipline's histories remain fraught with violent legacies of a modernist telos, utopian dreams, and heroic actors, whether operating under the rubric of techno-social programs of reform, humanitarian aid, or avant-garde refusals. Yet we might still hope that the obsession with the future harbors progressive political potentials in the right hands, that it can release other potentialities, even abruptly reconfigure this battlefield. Given the warlike behavior of others seeking to script new rules of the game, long marginalizing Indigenous knowledge systems, instrumentalizing nature as environment and as a resource to be developed, while making claims to the global good that seek to force political consensus favoring techniques of capital, legacies of which were rendered so visible by the pandemic, the question remains how else architecture might play the game of scripting futures. The all too brutal interruption of lives and plans launched by COVID-19 reminded us not only that the world is interconnected, but that the future does not necessarily follow a linear trajectory of telos, that abrupt change is possible, derailing projections and scripts. It also revealed blockages and inequities to be politically and economically designed, while identifying entry points, moments of vulnerability, weaknesses to exploit, and rapidly shifting priorities and functions. Architects, too, are experts at recognizing entry points and exploiting opportunities and points of connection. They put things together, they refunction, they revalence words and images. So can one appropriate architecture's tendency to operationalize, but insist on using its techniques otherwise? Can architects, too, seek to redirect the disposition of this machine, or to produce a blockage, to throw the right sort of spanner in the works? Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much, Felicity, for this really thoughtful and critical reflection on the terms and the entanglement of architecture with politics and capitalism. I would want to go straight into conversation, but we want to listen to the other two panelists, and I hand over, and I'm very happy to see and listen to Lee Stickels' presentation tonight. Lee, back to you.
Thanks, Rochus. Thanks, Peter. It's really lovely to be here with you. Before I get started, I do want to make a quick acknowledgement that I live and work. I'm coming to you for this session from unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And particularly, I'm very proud to live in Redfern, which is the heart of Sydney's urban Aboriginal community. What I'd like to bring into the discussion today is something about architecture's capacity for helping to materialize spaces in which regular daily life is performed in a radically different fashion. So I'm kind of setting aside questions about the profession and I guess collective agency of the profession, maybe discipline, to speak a little more broadly, I guess. So what I'm talking about is thinking architecture as critical to the production of everyday utopias. I'll unpack that a little. Here, I'm very heavily leaning on Davina Cooper. Davina Cooper is a political and legal theorist. Her inspiring work on this idea, which also riffs off trajectories in utopian studies that consider the utopian more as an orientation or attunement. Think Ruth Levitas's utopia as method, for instance. So we're not talking about utopia as a static notion of the perfect society to be imagined and executed. There's been generations of critique of that understanding. It doesn't need me to rehearse it now. So in her work, Cooper has considered a wide range of social experiments, everything, for example, from a Canadian bathhouse that operated as a women and trans casual sex space, community trading networks, and the famous UK alternative school Summerhill. One of the things that she emphasizes is their material dimension. So again, that they're not utopias as implementations of blueprints, but spaces requiring establishment, ongoing maintenance, and adjustment of regulating conventions and structures. They confront the mechanics of regular, sometimes boring existence. The initiatives of the everyday utopia build, literally, capacity to test and imagine new, using Cooper's terms here, new conceptual lines. The everyday, in this idea of everyday utopia, means addressing the reconfiguration of prosaic dimensions of regular life, things like eating, sleeping, sex, childbirth, cleaning, building, teaching, and so on, performed in innovative and socially ambitious ways. In this way, everyday utopias both challenge and reveal prevailing norms and ideologies. They are not abstract utopias in Bloch's terms, that is, not compensatory fantasies, where the future world remains the same except for the dreamer's place in it. The example often given here is, perhaps you win the lottery. Rather, they're more like what he called concrete utopias, reaching forward and anticipating a possible future. Everyday utopias are worked on. They're contingent, they're flawed even. The failures and struggles, we might say, are as important as successes. So in terms of agency, it's in terms of the idea of agency, how these spaces and their material practices might connect to transformative politics. This is where I think Cooper's thinking on everyday utopia is really useful. She emphasizes instances where the imagining and actualization of concepts failed to cohere in simple linear ways, and suggests that these kinds of moments point us to political pressure points and can lead away to different forms of imagining. So there's a certain amount of friction that's important here. And I'll try and get at this through an example, and I'll use something from my own research here. So I have a key interest in work that I've done in ways architecture is used to reimagine everyday environments and practices towards more egalitarian, democratic, emancipatory, ecologically attuned modes of living. That's meant looking at the architecture of intentional communities, ecological design experimentation, model houses, for instance. So I'm going to use the example of this drawing to talk about. So this is a building from a community begun in the 1970s in northern New South Wales. This is a group of people that came together to share land and live by principles informed by anti-consumerism, ideas of deep ecology, and Buddhism, for instance. And they're part of a wave of similar communities in the region in that period. These were communities as places set apart to materialize these non-mainstream ways of living, but also they rubbed up against the mainstream community in which they were embedded or adjacent to. Their ways of dwelling, of working and schooling and eating, their kinship models, produced friction. So one thing that happens in the material enacting and working through of their ideas is innovative forms of living. And we can see them traced a little in this drawing. So if we notice, for instance, there's no bathroom or kitchen. This was called a dwelling segment. It was part of what was called an expanded house. So the domestic infrastructures, bathroom, kitchens, were distributed around the site in ways that reset private and communal distinctions. There's also no enclosure on the southern facade. They developed building techniques that responded to the site, the climate, and living patterns. So here, a sunken garden, the position on the slope, the orientation to prevailing winds, prevented rain from entering mostly. You could pull down a blind if you needed. And the subtropical climate meant that sealing and heating the building wasn't such a big concern. So far, so good. There's a kind of alignment in the materialization of these principles. But there are also, as I said, there's this friction and unexpected outcomes, this, different lines away from the enacting of these ideas. So for example, women's building clubs emerged in these communities out of confronting the very gendered roles that still existed in them in terms of domestic duties, in terms of building practices. But more broadly, what I want to point to is the way the communities of disjunctive proximity to the mainstream had bigger effects. So regionally, in the period, there'd been this kind of détente about the living conditions and buildings that existed. This was illegal, this kind of building at the time. But protests against rainforest logging at the end of the 1970s that involved a lot of people from these communities ended that détente. So this mainstream community, via sort of local councils, which was very dependent on logging, was very much more, it was more thoroughly challenged by the presence of these, what were called the new settlers. And their homes and lifestyles became a point of attack. So councils issued demolition orders. There were court cases. And this drawing was at the centre of a Land and Environment Court appeal against demolition orders. This was a bricolage of salvaged materials. This had never been drawn up. So this drawing is a retrospective action as part of the defence. The community never imagined that this is what they were going to end up doing. This is, this is one of the, picking up on Cooper's point, this is where the materialization, so this is where, in the production of this architecture, we see these different trajectories emerge in this site, in this everyday utopian site. They didn't imagine they were going to be doing this, but they developed various networks. They were able to call on particular kind of expertise in terms of building. They developed rationales for the kinds of housing that they had produced, and they fought that case. And while a lot of the houses in the region were demolished and communities kind of disbanded, in this particular case, they won that appeal. And again, we talk about these differing lines out of such experiments. A set of experimental building zones was created to allow further development of these kinds of building techniques and the structural techniques that they were using. And eventually legislation was enacted for what was called multiple occupancy. So it formalized some of the kinds of land sharing that was going on. So the point is, this building had to happen for these concepts to emerge in the lived experience of the making of the community, and they're trying to materialize these aspirations that they've begun with. And it's the frictions with the mainstream community, where we see failures, we see the demolitions, we see communities disappear, but also sometimes productive disjunctures, new possibilities and building cultures opening up. So now here I'm quite possibly stretching too far Cooper's conceptualization of everyday utopias. She focuses on sites that are engaged in more discrete temporalities, such as the feminist bathhouse or community trading scheme, and you could say are much more embedded in mainstream settings than the intentional communities. But I still think that this particular reading of the utopian is useful for getting at some of architecture's potential, broadly thought. Because what it means is setting aside more limited understandings of utopia as simply idealism. In that sense, the utopian imagination is characterized, it's always characterized as an autonomous domain from which new ways of living are conjured ex nihilo. Following Cooper's conception of everyday utopian practice, we would focus rather on the importance of material practices and spaces. Everyday concepts become both actualized and imagined otherwise through the forging differently of sites and ways of doing things. So architecture has a fascinating power in this through its conceptual, material, temporal dimensions. The ways it brings ideas, things, people, and practices together in particular assemblages, remade together over and over. Now, it's an unstable power, to be sure, to be really frank about it, but still it's a power to help this ongoing process of bringing into being adventurous social spaces, and in turn, their power to affect what we can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I think we'll move quickly along to Jonathan.
Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I want to preface my presentation by saying that my research is mainly focused on exploring architecture's potential as a medium of communication. And this can be seen in my dissertation, Mystic Media, which sought to demonstrate how the immersive multimedia environments developed by the expanded cinema movement of the 1960s and 70s employed different spatial typologies to evoke the phenomenological and epistemological conditions associated with transcendental phenomena. Now, it is in this last phrase, transcendental experiences, that we see something of a utopia, a countercultural utopia, built out of psychedelic experiences and collective consciousness. In this way, my research, as represented in my dissertation and a separate book which I'm currently working on, has frequently engaged in utopian thinking. And today I want to talk about 3 utopian narratives that I juggle with in my work, which I realize is the exact opposite to the grounded everyday realities described by Lee Stickels. I'm going with the big stories here. And those meta-narratives will be based on politics, architecture, and media. Now, here I want to posit that most utopian thinking, as it has happened in the past, is built upon a meta-narrative of progressive history. And according to this theory, history is not merely a succession of events born out of local circumstances, but can be divided into major eras of human progress that are directed by some guiding principle. Also, these meta-narratives usually terminate at a point called the end of history, when we have reached the peak of the principle and all social conditions have been resolved, or what we may call utopia. Now, in the field of politics, this term, the end of history, may evoke the work of the conservative social scientist Francis Fukuyama, who posited that the end of the Cold War resulted in the absolute triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism, and this constituted the final stage of human ideological evolution. He based this theory by looking at the dialectic meta-narratives of George Hegel and Karl Marx, noting that Hegel, coming from a philosophical tradition of idealism, believed that the historical process is driven by the contest between the dominant ideologies of a time, called the spirit of the times, or zeitgeist. And this would ultimately sublate into the absolute consciousness when we have perfected the ideas of the Enlightenment. Conversely, Marx took this same dialectical engine and fueled it with something different, materialism, arguing that the historical process is determined by the material conditions of the time, that being the means of production and those who owned and operated them, and that the end of history would come as the proletarians would beat the bourgeoisie and usher in the communist utopia. Now, in a meta sort of way, Fukuyama attempted to resolve the dialectic tension of these two dialectic models, creating a synthesis that ultimately favoured the Hegelian thesis over the Marxist antithesis. Although he concedes to Marx that the last conflict would be between capitalism and communism, he does not see this as a conflict of material concerns, but rather as an ideological contest, and that the Cold War would seem to demonstrate that Marx had backed the wrong horse. Now, in 1993, as an immediate response to this triumphalism, Jacques Derrida wrote the book Specters of Marx. In it, he draws upon the ghostly metaphors used in Hegel and Marx's writing to invent the term hauntology. Now, a portmanteau of the word haunt and ontology, he used this term to demonstrate that philosophers overestimate the importance of presence within our ontology. He reminds us that our present is always informed by our memories of the past and expectations of the future. And that is that our present is informed or haunted by that which is absent. Now, shifting from philosophy to politics, he uses the term hauntology to describe that whilst communism might be ideologically dead, we are still haunted by the material conditions of inequality. After the global financial crisis of 2008, the leftist cultural critic Mark Fisher sought to elaborate on the lingering effects of these two works. In relation to Fukuyama, Fisher argues that the end of history necessarily comes with a corollary condition, what he calls the cancellation of the future. Here he continues by saying that with the triumph of capitalism, the left finds it increasingly difficult to imagine a utopian future without either being accused of capitulating to corporate interests or circling back to the horrors of the Soviet Union. Now, I cannot attest to the universality of this argument, but I will point out it seems particularly prevalent amongst British social critics, indicating that Margaret Thatcher's dismantling of the post-war welfare state continues to haunt that country. Very few lament the fall of the Soviet Union, so it's the losses suffered under Thatcher and Reagan that have really hurt the left. Anyway, connecting this to Derrida's hauntology, Fisher argues that with the future that will not arrive, we are stuck with a past that will not leave. Claiming that our culture is incapable, or it finds increasingly difficult to, of imagining alternatives to the status quo without having to recycle to how the past envisaged the future would be, culminating in a cultural nostalgia we have for retro futures. Here I want to argue that these conditions parallel the meta-narratives associated with the utopian efforts of modern architecture. And I will do this with reference to the architectural historian Reinhold Martin's book, Utopia's Ghost. In the early part of this book, he equates modernism's failure to fulfill its utopian promises with Fukuyama's theory of the end of history. Thus, we can connect the death of modernism to Fisher's theory of the cancellation of the future. As a side note, it is a strange twist of fate that the destruction of two buildings by Minoru Yamazaki had played a central role in these two meta-narratives. In architecture, the destruction of the Pruitt-Igoe Towers in 1972 and onwards is, according to Charles Jenks, the death of modernism, which is a persistent story despite many attempts to refute it. And just to go with kind of the opening lines that we said, maybe this is the smoke of modernism that Colin Rowe could have been referring to. Now, also in politics, the attack on the Twin Towers marks the moment where the end of history had itself come to an end, in that Samuel Huntington's theory on the clash of civilizations became the dominant discourse of neoconservatives in the early 2000s. Now, I've put asterisks here because I think that these stories require a lot more unpacking than I can give here. Anyway, in the latter part of the books, Martin uses the concept of hauntology and the past that will not leave to describe postmodernism, citing the La Strada Novissima exhibition at the 1980s Venice Biennale, which had the theme of the presence of the past, including the likes of Paulo Portuguese's, who parodies the opening line of the Communist Manifesto when he wrote, "A spectre is roaming Europe, postmodern." Of course, it is no secret that there is a moment between the modern and postmodern, which my fellow panelist Felicity Scott has described in her work as the Techno-Utopia, or the Counter-Cultural Utopia, and seems to be an ongoing work. And whilst this moment is often associated with the celebration of human agency, it too had its own meta-narratives. Here, I want to talk about one of the meta-narratives stemming from Marshall McLuhan's media theory. With it, I shift from my current work to my dissertation. Now, comparing again to Marx, I'll compare this again to Marx, who argued that history is driven by the political and economic systems brought about by industrial machines and the changing means of production. McLuhan retorted by saying that it is driven by the phenomenological and epistemological conditions encouraged by new media technologies and how they recalibrate our modes of perception. So whilst Marx might talk about the modes of productions associated with hunter-gatherer, agricultural and industrial societies, McLuhan talks about the perceptual changes that occur between oral, scribal, literate, mass audience and peer-to-peer societies, the latter two being achieved by recent and digital media. And according to this narrative, since electronic and digital media are so immersive, they do not afford us the spatial and cognitive distance we need to deliberatively attend to it, and as such we attend to it intuitively. With language fraught, very fraught with cultural insensitivity, he described the diminished epistemology as returning humanity to the tribal echo of the global village. In this way, McLuhan's end of history does not move forwards towards a utopia, but apocalyptically circles back to the origins of human experience. Here, my research constructs a model of the environmental aspects of McLuhan's media theory, which I called McLuhan's Maelstrom, which also just happened to be the title of my master's thesis. I don't know if you remember that, Raisbeck. This Maelstrom argues that the media environment mainly interacts with our perceptual, physiological and psychological systems through affect, not meaning, through stimulation, not information. In this way, it first alters how we see the world, then how we feel about it, and then how we think about it. And at each stage, it erodes our epistemological tools we would use to critically attend to it, thus blinding us to the media environment, turning it into what McLuhan described as the invisible environment. And that this would create a vicious cycle that would drag us down, as if it was a maelstrom. On this point, McLuhan writes, the very absence of an understanding is an eloquent testament to the power of media to anesthetize the very modes of awareness in which they are most operative. Now, according to McLuhan, the only solution to this was to break the cycle with counter environments, that being immersive multimedia environments that would replicate the experience of being within an invisible environment, but administered within the controlled context of art, so that audiences could be prepared to attentively deconstruct those experiences. A lot of artists of the 1960s and 70s answered this call, many of which are catalogued in a manifesto called Expanded Cinema, written by Gene Youngblood in 1970. In this book, Youngblood called for artists to create counter-environments by expanding the language of cinema, combining it with theatre, computer art, and architecture. However, there is also a tonal shift between these two theorists. Whilst McLuhan is apocalyptic, Youngblood is back to utopian, in that he views the coming media environment as offering ever more perfect worlds in which to see ourselves with. In that case, he's quoting the works of Teilhard de Chardin. Now, I have written a deep dive into some of the projects that Younger Blood has mentioned in expanded cinema, namely the Labyrinth and Cerebrum, which you can read about in the Journal of Architecture and the Journal of Design History. The Labyrinth was a multimedia pavilion created by the National Film Board of Canada for the Montreal World Exposition in 1967. In it, we see a merger of cinema and architecture, which uses spatial design to throttle between McLuhan's theories on the phenomenological and epistemological differences between the eye and the ear. Conversely, Cerebrum was a hybrid between a nightclub and a gallery, which existed in a New York warehouse for a few months in 1968. Here we see participatory theatre, enhanced by a whole arsenal of multimedia systems, which sought to recreate the feelings of synesthesia, and in particular reflects McLuhan's belief that touch served as the common language by which all sensory information must be converted into before we can make sense of it. So from sight to sound to touch, we find ever more intimate and immediate forms of experience. This encourages a more intuitive rather than deliberatively mode of relating to the world. So what is the purpose of showing you meta-narratives that lead to failed utopias and even possible apocalypses? Well, the first is to catalogue my research, and the second is to remind us of the possible pitfalls of utopian thinking, at least as we have wielded it in the last 2.5 centuries. Utopian meta-narratives are seductive because they are built on the idea of inevitability, by which external forces will carry us through history. This hubris can either lead to complacency, in which we diminish our agency, or they can be used to justify bad decisions, such as those found in modernist urban planning. Politics, architecture, and media will not carry us through a better world. However, we can use these as tactics in a larger strategy that celebrates human agency. With that said, those who use architecture do have a bit of a head start. Our end of history, our cancellation of the future, happened 20 to 30 years before the absolute failures of political utopias. We have failed early, and as such, we have more time to come to terms with the pitfalls of doctrine and return to the task of designing for a social mission with a greater deal of humility. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Now, I think I'm going to give you a big general question to get you started talking, and you can then take it wherever you want to take it. I was pretty interested in the many cautions and dangers that Felicity outlined, and it made me think a little bit about how we might, as architects, escape the black box, escape these sort of imperative language. And in listening to you and looking at all your work, I'm wondering if, and thinking about the previous 2 panels that we had, which looked at different kinds of knowledge and different ways of knowing, I'm wondering if each of you might want to comment on the idea of mysticism as a way out. And I suppose I mean by that experiences that are somehow outside of the instrumental and outside of the sort of mechanics of capital, because I think in each in your own ways, you do kind of touch on that. Jonathan touches on sort of, I suppose, mystical experiences. I think, Lee, you seem to touch on issues around mysticism. I think you mentioned it briefly in intentional communities. And I think looking at the different relays in your body of work, Felicity, it seems to me that in the countercultures and certainly in your very early work on Rudofsky, there seems to be a sort of element there of the mystic. And I'm just wondering if that's a good place for us to start our discussion. Right.
Is that
hanging space in air? That's okay.
I was just saying it's an enormous question, and I don't have a really good answer except to say something like in the work. I didn't really speak to this work, but in the work that I'm doing that returns to the Habitat conference and looks at a series of of films that were produced in this context, produced in order to govern governments. Yeah, so produced with an entirely sort of instrumental logic. What one finds are, and these are films produced throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the so-called West, but what one finds over and over again are gestures and sometimes even like formal camera shots that refuse to signify in the language of the developmental telos. And I'm fascinated by these, not so much to sort of primitivize those gestures, but to recognize the ways in which they are speaking back to the sort of subjectification that they're intended to perform. And so I'm actually very interested in these moments where things that cannot be integrated, or that actually are actively recovered and recuperated to speak back, appear outside the representational or sort of system of rationality assumed to be largely at work. And that's, I mean, I know that's not entirely answering your question, but I'm if I have heroes in my work, it's those types of moments that do mark out ways of navigating this type of apparatus of control that I'm otherwise so obsessed with. And so the mystic would be one way of framing or superstition or things that mark an outside to modern forms of subjectivity, which is not to say the mystic is not also very much within the stories of the counterculture that I look at. And of course, this is Jonathan's expertise, and he can speak in more detail to this, but transcendental and the appeal to Eastern religions and Eastern cultures, and their again, appropriation and refunctioning in the 60s and 70s are, marks of the projection of that outside, again, onto other cultures and its recovery. Anyway, this is not answering your question, but I'm saying it does enter into my framework.
It does enter into your framework, and I think that is a good answer, in as much that, maybe we should be more aware of those moments that escape outside of the so-called black box, and maybe we do find them in some of those, I suppose, media experiments or media projections in the 60s. And I think I've done a bit of work on Boyd's Space Tube at Expo 67. And during that, there was this whole, at the end of it, this whole sort of multimedia thing, which is, I think, a sort of kind of light show of a sort of fantasia. So, Jonathan, let's throw that to you. What do you think about these moments? You're probably the expert on mystical experiences, and are there dangers in that, or can we use those sorts of ways of knowing to reconfigure utopia in architecture?
Well, I guess in some respects, a lot of my work is actually trying to maybe systematize what it actually constitutes a mystical experience. We tend to think of, I guess one of my pet peeves is like, I love phenomenological architecture. I love, like, I see students in schools like really engage with it, but they struggle to articulate how they would go about doing it. It's so airy-fairy that we can't put it to words. We can only put it to paper and maybe build it. And so I guess what I've tried to do is systematize the mystical, which is almost a quixotic, endeavor. But I think McLuhan probably does a pretty good job of that. And I think he does it because basically what he's trying to do is boil things down to phenomenology of immersion versus distance, versus intuition versus deliberativeness. That's the epistemological kind of equation that he's trying to apply there. And this can be seen in his theories of acoustic space and visual space. He argued that with the immersive nature of electronic and maybe digital media, that we would become more immersed in media and therefore respond to in a more intuitive way, and we would have a more intuitive worldview. So the artists of that time in the counterculture were trying to, in some respects, prepare us for that. But also, in the same time, they kind of looked at that not as like something that we needed to prepare for, but something that we should embrace. Where Cluen saw apocalypse, they saw psychedelia. And the interesting word about the etymology of those words is apocalypse means to uncover, and psychedelia means to uncover the mind. So there's this uncovering of kind of a baser aspect, a baser humanity, if you might say, like something that's beyond the artifice that we apply in, our social constructs, relate to each other in a social way, in that way. So in that way, I'll maybe switch to some of the actual religious scholars that have studied in my work, such as there's a blank. William Turner, I believe. No, please excuse me as I forget who I've written about in the past. Yeah, well, Turner, he was someone who studied the kind of the ritual process. And what he used to argue was that there was 3 phases to a ritual. There was the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning is where you would strip someone of their social status. The end is when you would load them with a social status and reintroduce them into society. It's kind of looking at the rites of passages. It's in this inner moment, this liminal phase, that he says that the initiates of any of these rituals would be stripped, would be betwixt and between statuses. They were stripped of their old status and they had their new status before they had given their new status. And so in this kind of weird liminal phase, they kind of related to each other as human beings as opposed to people with a status. So I think that's some of the stuff that I've been looking about in mine. And some people saw that as a very utopian moment, to strip away the artifice, to strip away the alienation that it existed in the post-war period. They kind of wanted to extend that liminal phase for as long as possible by creating these kind of alternate and intentional communities. So that's where I'm seeing this impulse happening, and architecture has the ability to do that with its spatial and sensory tactics that I believe that McLuhan tried to do.
I think your ideas about rituals certainly has something to do with this notion. I'm not quite sure how we got to this. We might return to more concrete things in a minute. But Lee, your everyday ideas, or how do you see mysticism? Do you see that and the sorts of things we're sort of fishing around with? I mean, it's a little bit fuzzy. From your perspective in your work, how do you see that as an opportunity for architects to escape the dangers of utopian thinking?
Well, yeah, I was trying to think how to get some purchase on the idea of mysticism that we're batting around here. And I think the term estrangement has come up. And I think that's maybe where I can hook into it a little, in the way that some of the example I gave and the examples that Cooper and others give as the everyday utopias of these sites where there are these repeated estrangements. So they produce material sites, spaces, but then also these affective aspects that allow certain ways that we live to be estranged and to be rethought and remade. So whether that, in the example I gave, whether that's the sort of kinship notions and this creation of new kind of models of elective family life in these communities, or ways of relating to the land, and that's maybe a good example where we can see the productive potential. So we can see things that we can now label the emergence of a kind of ecologically attuned architecture, But in that estrangement and in that, as has been pointed out, sometimes this adoption, this identification with Eastern religions, or identifications with indigenous connections to land and country. These sites also develop problematic kind of connections as well, and that's why I really emphasize that unstable power. So then with that mysticism in the very kind of discrete, low-key way that I was maybe describing, it's this unstable estrangement that produces these productive lines, but also requires that, we might say, requires a constant kind of negotiation, requires a constant kind of vigilance in terms of what is produced. I don't know if that helps, bring that every day into dialogue, maybe with the kind of Jonathan's meta narratives and Felicity's address to those larger dominating structures that architecture works within. Hopefully.
I don't know, other members of the panel, you want to pick that up or add to it?
And I have a question that I would like to ask, particularly directed to Felicity Scott. I've got one for you too, Lee, but I'll go with the order of operations here. What I guess in my own little presentation, I mean, I kind of cast doubts on these meta narratives, but the one that I didn't really say that there was an end or an exact refutation of was with media. And that was basically generally indicative of my thinking that we find ourselves in an era where it's increasingly hard to think of a utopia, and the only one we have left is technological. And that tracks well with this romanticization, this utopia that can possibly be in space-age colonization. So I want to ask, how is the difference between the kind of speculation of, the 60s, 70s that we saw in those images versus like the very, I guess you could say, real promises that are being offered right now? And how does that relate to, like, what are the differences between these moments that you see? Similarities, maybe.
Just to get you to clarify the second point, did you say the promises for today, or?
Yeah, so for instance, I mean, like there's a lot of hype about, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, colonization of Mars, something like that. So these things are being offered to us now as something that's about to happen. Okay. So yeah, how does that relate to kind of these past?
Okay, no, that's a great question. I just wanted to make sure I understood it. I mean, I was going, and in regard to well, actually, most of my work is, let's say, motivated, or it finds stakes, somewhere in thinking something like the persistence of the past, to come back to this hideous formulation, but not in a postmodern way, but certainly in a way that concerns haunting, and so well, not just haunting. I mean, I think I can trace very clear trajectories from the work of Gerard K. O'Neill in the mid-1970s, and his the very first conference on space colonization was funded by Stuart Brand out of money derived from the Whole Earth Catalog, right at the time when Brand was involved in some of the very first teleconferencing demonstrations. And so on the one hand, we have Brand recognizing the potential for a sort of extractive industry in outer space, refunctioning the American economy. And on the other hand, we have him recognizing that the new media technical infrastructures, facilitating communication across the distance, are also going to refunction forms of life and of subjectivity. And so, I could trace, quite directly from those, the sort of promotion of a certain model of collapse of Earth environment, of the possibilities of American technical know-how, continuing its expansionist ethos, all the way through to SpaceX and Blue Origin, and in the middle of that, one would find a whole series of actors who would come directly from the early point of my story to found the L5 Society, who would go on to operate as agents with Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program. And so, so when Trump announces a sixth force of the US, branch of the US military, the Space Force branch, with the possibility of colonizing Mars in the near future, these are absolutely like recovering tropes that first appear in the mid to late 1970s. And so my work, is precisely about that continuity and how these utopian ideals actually find traction in political and economic paradigms, particularly models of financialization and a shift away from sort of federal funding of science and space research into private industry. So, exactly that continuity is what is at stake for me in recovering work from the 60s and 70s. That's how and I could do similar things with much of my other work. Sort of what's at stake.
Jump in there. I'm actually questioning why that colonization of Mars would be a promise. It's more like, the threat of continuing as we have been doing in the last several hundred years. So I think the question or the question we raise in the pedagogical context is more like that utopia might mean we have to really rethink what architecture is and how we practice in our role and agency. And because we're so embedded in, as you said, Lee, building codes and legislation, in a way, we also have to possibly work on changing these conditions in order actually to change the contract we're having with society. And when we think and reflect on that, we are responsible for 40% of the CO2 carbon footprint in the world, we really have to start acting here and potentially, 40 years ago. And we're 40 or 50 years a bit late, but as I think you said, Jonathan. But so I think what I'm seeing a little bit is like this kind of, we have this really big global problem and then the whole entanglement with politics and capitalism. So we all should become Marxists, actually, I think, that's kind of the proposition. But on the other hand, then Lee points forward and puts something forward, which is really about like, how can we act locally and in our own means. So we have both. It's not an either or. It's how can we kind of address both? What I'm always interested in is like, what does that mean for architectural education? Yeah. So on the weekend there was a panel discussion about, we have like 40% who do something else and 60% who stay in the industry. And I try to make the point, but that 60% we should talk about, not the 40 who already do something else. It's more like the 60 who stay in the industry, and how could you change the industry through implementing or raising these questions in pedagogy and education, which I think is the power we have in education, that you can at least plant the seeds of thinking about your profession in a different way, and you go out in the workforce and then you bring up the topics and say, oh no, maybe we should look at that in a different way, because we have to start acting from our agency and not rely on and wait for legislation and codes to be changed. We have to push for codes to be changed or find the gaps and raise the question. I think that's what I found with Jonathan really interesting with the media. I don't know how we got to mysticism, Peter, but like with the media and like, using the power of the image. And we had that in the discussion with Feral Atlas, like, the illustration and the image, how it could really thrive and articulate ideas which are enormously complex, but they give an opportunity to communicate it to a large audience and not just to ourselves on a little panel. So to communicate through opening up alternatives and storytelling in a way, and imagination of how could it be is a really powerful source, and that's where it becomes utopian. So, but I like to actually, it was more a comment than a question, but I would like to hear Lee more about, also from the context of like, how do you in your educational pedagogical practice beyond the research, like where do you see, is there a chance or is there an opportunity? I know you've done a lot of things like exhibitions and panels and workshops, and editing books, and so is there a way how we can be optimistic in a way? I mean, I'm not that at the moment, but we should be, because otherwise we give up. And how could that become part of your or our all agency as pedagogues in a tertiary university system educating so-called architects?
It's really tricky, and I was worried you were going to ask just that kind of question, because sometimes I feel very awkward sitting in a professional school of architecture when the trajectory of my research has taken me so often to essentially, looking at the work of non-architects, so they're not professional architects. I've opened up what I'll take on as architecture in the scheme of things, and so that makes it very difficult to then, when say moving into the studio, for instance, what do you take and transfer into that context where you're explicitly kind of training future professional architects? It's a really hard one. I guess what that example that I gave, there were architects involved in there, often providing expert knowledge that these communities could then deploy. There were these networks that became active, that worked to try and create this space for experimentation, and what eventually became changes to building codes and became changes to planning legislation. So there is that, there's a line for us, but it does, I guess the lesson there might be that it does require that real risk of opening up what we think of as the profession, opening up who we can work with and how we work with them, and rethinking sets of pedagogical structures and processes that tend towards reinforcing a profession that works with a kind of predetermined imaging of what should be, of our environments and so on.
Or a very passive role we take very often, yeah? So like as we respond to demands rather than be caretakers of others, huh?
I think that's right. And thinking about this just before, the question that I'd had for Felicity maybe relates in that I was really interested to kind of hear, Felicity, what you might have meant towards the end of your presentation. You talked about still this kind of need or the possibility for architects, I guess in the professional sense, to still produce or to appropriate tools for disrupting, for producing the kind of blockages. What was in your mind at that point?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer somewhat abstractly, and I have a question for you too, Lee. I'll remember to ask. I did some slightly apotropaic gestures around refusing to tell architects what to do. I see my role really as helping render legible how to think architecture in relationship to all of these other techniques and forces, and to recover stories of different forms of intervention that might indeed capture their imagination, not unlike, old-fashioned utopian images or narratives of modernist progress. And so So I don't see my role so much as identifying precisely, what needs to be done. I see my role as trying to mark out potentials and openings and things that still require a creative act of translation on the part of designers or of my students. And so, I see that type of claim as an invitation, not as a roadmap, so to speak. And this is also what I think that the historical work does. And which is not to say that I don't believe in those potentials, but it is to say that I think we all have different roles to play. And this is actually why I really liked the resonance between my presentation and Lee's. We're operating at very different scales, but we're not in any way in disagreement, I don't think, in terms of how to think architecture. The answer is we need to think at every scale through many different facets and come up with slightly different tactical ways of reconstituting, what defines the field. And so, I would add to your response to Rochus that even the work you're doing at that micro scale, finding different languages and different voices, is already contributing to the question of how else to teach architecture. Yeah, like laying out the framework for thinking in very different ways, and not needing to. I haven't shown an image of Peter Eisenman in probably a decade now, but, not needing to even lean on those characters as foils. I think that, that this is, these are powerful tools in themselves. But my question to Lee would go something like this. I was really struck by the plan that was drawn, that translated these different material practices and everyday forms of experience, and sort of translate the lived experience of testing these forms of life into a very conventional architectural document, not for design, but for the form of a legal battle over a demolition order. And I'm just wondering, sort of like, who did that drawing, and how did they reconcile their practices with the translation of those practices into something, like a plan. And I think this is it was a really fascinating document.
This is, and thanks Felicity, because I really love that. You've given me maybe a new vocabulary there. I love that idea of what we do via these kinds of historical projects as producing a kind of invitation for those that we work with, those who are in our schools and moving towards some kind of professional practice. That's a really, I think, helpful way of thinking how all this stuff can be productive. In terms of that drawing, so that drawing was it was drawn by Colin Cole James, who was a architect, planner, educator, kind of housing activist, and he produced that. He was working at the University of Sydney at the time, very sympathetic to the communities in northern New South Wales, and I guess commissioned to make that drawing and help that community out by a guy called Peter Hamilton, who had trained as an architect and had kind of retreated to this, was part of that community. And so he's drawing on his connections to try and build this appeal case against the demolition orders. So that drawing, then becomes part of you could say, kind of suite of drawings that get produced over, I don't know, sort of a decade, as the kind of the process moved from appealing demolition orders and getting a win there through to advocating for these experimental building zones and for kind of relaxation of building regulation, the application of building codes in these places, that included much more, I guess, cartoonish kind of diagrams and so on, but they're produced by James along with other colleagues and students as they develop things like building manuals for these new settlers, as they were called, so that they had these kind of rules of thumb to work with so that they could build safely, and that building inspectors for the council could come and assess what had been built and hopefully give it a building certificate. So it becomes a kind of a tool, it's a reappropriation of professional drawing there for a very specific circumstance, and then becomes part of, as I say, this kind of suite of other kind of diagrams, cartoons and so on that get used towards these other ends. And it's, so it's a nice example, I think, of a particular historical point where circumstances come together and allow another kind of deployment of professional expertise. And they're the kinds of moments that I'm interested where they open up, historically. As you say, that then become an invitation to thinking now and thinking our future differently, and our future as maybe architectural professionals, not just lay builders.
Well, as a person who teaches professional practice, I mean, I certainly feel hamstrung by the particular regulations that we have to teach to in the neoliberal university. And I think the only way out of that for me has been to create other courses, particularly the design activism course where we teach students things about civics and also basically how to run campaigns, and hopefully put a little spanner into the works somewhere along the line. I think I'm interested to hear again from Felicity. I won't ask you a question about mysticism again, but how are those sort of educational and pedagogical debates played out in the States? Because certainly here as academics, and I think probably Jonathan and Lee will agree as well, we feel enslaved by the neoliberal university without a lot of room to move. And I'm just wondering how they are from your perspective.
I'd say they're I was going to say they're almost worse because many of us teach in private institutions and subject to, but I don't feel like I know enough about what's going on in I mean, how you're being, let's say, regulated to answer that question. I mean, if you're talking about like the sort of instrumentalization of knowledge to utilitarian, like to productive ends, these sorts of things, to economic ends, or you're talking about just the eradication of the possibility of other modes of working within the institution. I maybe need.
Yeah, well, I think Lee and Jonathan might add to it, but and even Rochus, but I think we're subjected to a whole regime of different ways of regulation, from student experience scores to having to produce research outputs, you know, quite quickly. I think, you know, to say that we've got these sort of numbers up, that we're teaching in a way that the students become the sort of customers. And I think with COVID, many of the universities have now lost external income. I think in many ways, despite the fact that we work at a so-called public institution, it is very much a privatised institution. Our faculty has revenues, I think, at the pre-COVID of, you know, around about $90 million a year. The better part of that coming in from teaching, and it's, you know, because it's now lost a whole lot of income, then, you know, a lot of people who worked in the university in precarious roles are now disappeared. So I think to answer your questions, that's kind of perspective that we have. I think the university sector in Australia is very much being, you know, subjected to these sort of free market.
Okay, so in that regard, I mean, you know, certainly it would depend which part of the university you're in. And so a school like GSAP at Columbia is entirely tuition driven. And so absolutely it's increasingly reconceived as market driven. And so there are various forms of what once were sort of popularity contests, but are increasingly subject to metrics and new forms of measure and, you know, best practices. And they take similar forms. I mean, I think in a way, the US is benchmarking against things like the British system and the Australian system, and increasingly now adding that type of machinery. But in the past at Columbia, it was a little bit more informal, with the exception of the tenure process, where at that point, you know, things are measured. But in terms of teaching and research, otherwise, the structure is very different. There's no, you know, funding for research, with the exception of occasional small private grants, like from the Graham Foundation, and so in those regards, it works very, very differently. But in terms of the student happiness and how it's measured, and how that then gets mobilized for advertising purposes and turned into bar charts and all sorts of colored, you know, pie charts and things like this. Yeah, that's increasingly colonizing the institutional practice. But I think we're behind you on that.
Yeah, I think you might be a little bit behind us. Now, I don't know how we're going down another wormhole, but I think I was interested in asking all of you, I mean, about architects and science. And I think, interestingly, I think that when we look at, sort of start to think about care, does that notions of care and that ethics of care, does that then translate into health science? Our faculties are full of these sort of science nerds making things with parametrics. And when I see the space colonisation images that you showed, and that sort of utopian imaginary, I guess I do think where, and I think everyone can probably answer this, where are architects getting their knowledge about science, do you think? Do you think it is, do they look at those things and go, yeah, we can do that? Or is it coming from popular culture, or do you think it's actually coming from science, or is it a mix? So I guess I'm sort of wondering about those sort of issues.
I can answer it in relationship to the space colony drawings, which is to say that, you know, the architects are the architects and designers, and actually also renderers, but definitely there are architects involved here, are brought on to produce, you know, highly spectacularized images to sell this agenda, and so the images are functioning in a very particular way. They're clearly drawing on histories of science fiction renderings and these sorts of things, but there are endless scientists involved, you know, physicists, engineers, biochemists. There's endless testings of bodies and environments and plans and structures, almost all of which are equally as fictional as the architectural renderings when one actually puts any pressure on them. And so the architectural images that I showed, on the one hand, are produced in the context of a study at Stanford University with the Ames Research Center, the NASA Ames Research Center, and so they're ostensibly collaborations with the, you know, best and brightest scientific minds thinking about these types of artificial environments and how humans and other, you know, ecosystems will thrive in them. But again, they're, you know, this is an idea for agriculture in which there would be no insects, for instance. So this is like 1975, and they, didn't understand basic notions of pollination, or at least the people involved in the sort of ecological sciences that were collaborating. I mean, these are sort of extraordinary either oversights or forms of cynicism that created very powerful images geared towards getting funding for a certain idea, that of prioritizing space research. And so the question of how to evaluate the scientific sort of truths and fictions in this project and the tension there is very much part of what fascinates me.
That is fascinating, isn't it? And I think post-COVID, and I think in relation to the climate emergency, I think many of us are thinking science is kind of God, and what they say sort of goes, and we can't sort of theme it up, as I suspect the architects in your example may have done. But it's interesting you say that maybe the scientists themselves were caught in a particular paradigm. Jonathan, what do you think about those issues of architects and taking on board the science of the day or the science of the zeitgeist to want to...
Honestly, it's a bit of a hard question. It's a hard question to ask, in the sense that as I'm kind of pondering off into the distance trying to respond to it, I'm looking at my preferred way of listening to music, which is a reel-to-reel tape player, which shows how backwards thinking I generally am. But I guess, like, maybe just to reiterate the answer that was previously given, is like, there's so much of consumption of media that just anybody in society will do. They're going to come across images that will inspire them to either look forward, like into something deeper. So like, where do architects get their sense of scientists? Yeah, they're where do architects get their sense of science? It can either come from scientists, it can come from science fiction, but it's always going to be mediated. That would be the best thing that I could add to that discussion, is that, like, media. Yeah.
Always fashioned and shaped through some kind of media channel. Lee, what do you think about this? Is this question alien to you, or?
No, because a lot of the work that I've been looking at has it has a critical relation to technology debate. So a lot of the projects that I have been looking at spanning across the 70s have connections of some sort to things like the appropriate /soft/ biotechnical technology movement. So precisely this kind of mood and movement that develops in the 70s that is profoundly skeptical about the direction of modern industrialization, centralized science and technology, and its application. It has its own issues. So it's not alien to me. But the thing that did strike me though was, again, I guess it's a plug for all of us in this panel, in a sense, that connecting it to your previous question, that Felicity's description just then of the kind of architects as troops in the boosterism for space conquest and space colonies. It resonates pretty strongly with the way that architects now, continue to be. It's very kind of firm, I guess modernist telos, can easily become boosters of whatever applied science, applied technological priorities are given any day. We see, we all rub up against this, I think, I'm guessing, pretty strongly every day in the schools of architecture within which we work. And it's there where, Felicity again has pointed out the kind of, we might say, the importance of history in not in the imperative, again borrowing the words, not in the imperative, but I guess in a sense a reminder that we don't forget this tendency, this character of the profession that developed over the last century or so.
If there would be good closing words, a good comment to finish this discussion, if that's with everyone fine. I'm just wary of the time, but thanks everyone, Lee and Jonathan and Felicity, for joining us. I think we touched on many different directions, and Peter took us there. But I think it's nice, you know, there's so much we could discuss, and I think we the five of us probably could go on for hours and hours. But I like to point out that, you know, it's part of something to stimulate. It's not coming to a conclusion. It's something to keep us thinking and using a different format to inform students, scholars, and potentially industry locally and maybe even around the world if we want to be now colonizing the rest of the knowledge systems. But I like to point out this was the third of our fantastic panel discussions, and I very much enjoyed the presentations today. And I'd like to mention that on Monday we had Politics and Utopia and Architecture, Indigenous Knowledge Systems. So in case you missed that one, it's on the YouTube channel, the Melbourne School of Design. That discussion was on together with Professor Barbara Rochus from Paris and Uncle Leonard Clark, an Indigenous elder, Dr. Christine Phillips from RMIT, she collaborates with Leonard, and Dr. Hannah Robertson from Melbourne School of Design, who works with Indigenous communities across Australia. We also had just on Wednesday, Politics and Utopia and Architecture with a focus on knowing the Anthropocene, a very, very interesting panel discussion with the fantastic and exciting Feral Atlas editors, Anna Löwenhaupt-Singh from University of California and Dr. Alda Kellerman-Saxena. If you don't know about Feral Atlas, look it up, it's online. It's a Stanford University Press publication, but you actually can access it online. We also had our colleague Hélène Frichot and from Monash University Charity Edwards. So Peter, I think we had a busy week, 3 panel discussions, but I think we're getting into the mode to keep going with these.
And we've covered a lot of ground, and yes, I think you're right. We could talk all day with our panelists today about many of these issues, so thank you so much. So we'd also like to thank, this has been a great series, and I'm hoping that Rochus and I will continue it, perhaps as a podcast. Or more panels, Rochus. I think, as I keep saying, you know, I can do a sort of game show host thing. You can be a little bit more measured. And I think we would certainly like to thank James Rafferty, who has worked tirelessly on this and setting up the technology, which has got better and better each time. Jet Backer for liaising with our panelists, which has really meant that Rochus and I have had time to think about what we're talking about and doing. Philippa Knack, and again, thank you, panelists. It's been great to see you all. Some of you I haven't seen for some time, and certainly I would like to thank you, Rochus, for setting this up and being the champion of it. So thank you so much. So I think that's it. I don't know if you want to sign off, Rochus.
No, I think otherwise too much on me. It's not about me. Thanks very much. You have to cut that out, James. Thanks very much. And thanks to in the background for looking all over the recording. Is it all good,
Jonathan, for bringing up the word maelstrom, which threw me into a Radio Birdman tune, Descent in the Maelstrom. I was like, I haven't heard that word for a while.
I haven't heard it. It was the name of my my master's thesis that I did actually under Peter Raisbeck, and I'm like, oh no, there's another use for this. So I've just brought it up again.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you, Felicity. Thank you, Lee. Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Rochus, and I think James
in the real space again.
Yeah, we can end it there.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
Stay hopeful.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.